The wind howled through the mountain pass like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bite of early winter and the scent of snow yet to fall. Elizabeth Morales pressed herself deeper into the shallow cave she had found, her thin shawl doing little to ward off the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a familiar companion these past weeks since she had fled the mining town below, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of desperation. She had been begging for 3 days now, standing at the crossroads where the mountain trail met the main road, hoping that some traveler might take pity on her. Most passed by without a glance, their faces hard as the rocky terrain around them. Those who did stop looked at her with suspicion or disgust, as if poverty were a disease they might catch. The few coins she had managed to collect rattled pitifully in her empty stomach, not nearly enough for even a single meal. The sound of hoofbeats on stone made her lift her head from where it rested against her knees. Through the gathering dusk, she could make out the silhouette of a man on horseback, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in this harsh landscape. Even from a distance, there was something different about him. He sat straighter in his saddle than the rough miners and drifters who usually traveled this road, and his horse was well fed and groomed, a stark contrast to the mangy pack animals that usually passed this way. As he drew closer, Elizabeth could see that he was watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She had learned to read men quickly in these desperate weeks, to distinguish between those who might help and those who might harm. This one was harder to read than most. His face was weathered but not cruel, his eyes sharp but not predatory. When he reined in his horse directly in front of her hiding place, she felt a flutter of hope mixed with fear. Dennis Myers had been riding this mountain trail for the better part of 15 years, ever since he had struck silver in the high country and built his fortune from the unforgiving rock and earth. He had seen plenty of desperate souls in his time, but something about the young woman huddled in the cave made him pull up short. Maybe it was the way she held herself with a dignity that poverty had not quite managed to strip away, or maybe it was the intelligence in her dark eyes that spoke of better times and harder falls. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the loose shale. Elizabeth shrank back instinctively, but he made no move toward her, simply stood at a respectful distance and studied her face in the fading light. "You been here long?" His voice was rough from the mountain air, but not unkind. Elizabeth hesitated, unsure whether honesty would help or hurt her cause. 3 days, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Dennis nodded as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "Begging's a hard way to make a living up here. Most folks who travel this road don't have much to spare. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." The mountain wind seemed to pause as Elizabeth searched his face for any sign of mockery or cruelty, but found neither. Instead, there was something that might have been understanding, as if he knew what it meant to be desperate in an unforgiving world. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I lost everything when the mine closed down in Silver Creek. My husband died in the cave-in 6 months ago, and the company turned us out when they couldn't pay the workers anymore." Dennis absorbed this information without comment, his expression remaining neutral. He had heard similar stories before, but something about the way she told it, without self-pity or dramatic flourishes, made him believe her. There was a straightforwardness to her that he found refreshing after years of dealing with people who always seemed to want something from him. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elizabeth." "Elizabeth Morales." "I'm Dennis Myers." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I own some land up the mountain. Good land with a house that's got solid walls and a working fireplace. Been looking for someone to help keep it up, do some cooking and cleaning. Someone who knows how to work hard and doesn't mind the isolation." Elizabeth's heart began to beat faster, but she forced herself to remain cautious. She had learned the hard way that offers that seemed too good to be true usually were. "What would you want in return?" "Honest work, nothing more, nothing less." His tone was matter of fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than potentially changing both their lives. "But I'll tell you straight up, it's not an easy life. Winters are hard, and the nearest town is a full day's ride. Some folks can't handle the loneliness." Elizabeth looked around at the desolate landscape, at the cave that had been her shelter for 3 nights, at the empty road that had yielded so little hope. Loneliness seemed like a luxury compared to the desperation that had become her constant companion. "I can work hard," she said, lifting her chin with a pride that had surprised them both. "I kept house for my husband and took in washing for the other miners' wives. I know how to cook and clean and mend. I'm not afraid of work." Dennis studied her for a long moment, taking in the determined set of her jaw and the way she met his gaze without flinching. Most people who had fallen as far as she had would have been broken by now, but there was still fire in her eyes. That told him more about her character than any references could have. "The work's not the only thing you should consider," he said finally. "There'll be talk in town about a woman living up at my place. People will assume things, whether they're true or not. Some folks won't be kind about it." Elizabeth almost laughed at the irony. "People have been talking about me since my husband died and I couldn't pay the rent. They called me everything but my name when I had to start taking charity from the church. I learned to stop caring what people think when caring meant starving." There was a bitter edge to her words that spoke of recent wounds and hard-won wisdom. Dennis recognized the tone of someone who had been forced to choose between pride and survival and had chosen to survive. It was a choice he respected, having made similar ones himself in his younger days. "The pay would be fair," he continued, naming a sum that made Elizabeth's eyes widen. It was more than she had made in months of taking in washing, more than she had dared hope for when she had first started begging on this lonely road. "Room and board included, and you'd have your own space in the house. I'm not looking for anything complicated, just someone reliable who can help make the place feel less like a camp and more like a home." Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had cried enough in the past months to last a lifetime, and she sensed that this man would respect strength more than weakness. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Dennis was quiet for so long that Elizabeth began to worry she had said something wrong. When he finally spoke, his voice had a distant quality, as if he were remembering something from long ago. "I know what it's like to be hungry," he said simply. "I know what it's like to have people look right through you like you don't exist. And I know what it's like to wonder if tomorrow's going to be the day you finally give up." He paused, his eyes focusing on her again. "I also know that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to take a chance on you to change everything." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Elizabeth felt something shift inside her chest. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with genuine kindness that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. But even as hope began to bloom in her heart, practical concerns crowded in. "What if I disappoint you? What if I'm not what you're looking for?" "Then we'll figure it out as we go." Dennis's tone was pragmatic rather than romantic, which somehow made his offer seem more real and less like a dream that might evaporate at any moment. "I'm not expecting perfection, Elizabeth. I'm expecting honesty and effort. If you can give me those things, we'll get along fine." Elizabeth looked down at her hands, rough and red from weeks of hardship, and then back up at this stranger who was offering her something she had thought was lost forever. A chance at a decent life. The smart thing would be to ask more questions, to demand details and assurances. But she had learned that sometimes you had to take a leap of faith or risk falling into an even deeper pit. "When would you want me to start?" she asked. "Now, if you're willing, it's getting dark and there's weather coming in. My place is about 2 hours up the mountain, but it's warm and there's food." He gestured toward his horse. "You can ride behind me if you don't mind sharing the saddle." Elizabeth had never ridden a horse in her life, but she had also never been offered a way out of the desperate situation that had become her existence. She gathered her few possessions, which fit easily into the small bundle she had been carrying, and stood up on legs that shook slightly from cold and nerves. Dennis extended his hand to help her up, and she hesitated only a moment before taking it. His grip was strong and calloused, the hand of a man who had worked hard for everything he had. As he lifted her up behind him on the horse, she caught a scent of leather and wood smoke that somehow made her feel safer than she had in months. "Hold on tight," he said as they started up the narrow mountain trail. "The path gets rough in places. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around his waist, acutely aware of how long it had been since she had been close to another human being. The warmth of his body through his heavy coat was a comfort she had almost forgotten existed. As they climbed higher into the mountains, leaving the desolate crossroads behind, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, her luck was finally beginning to change. The trail wound through stands of pine and aspen, their branches creaking in the wind like old bones. Dennis guided his horse with the easy confidence of someone who knew every rock and root along the way. He didn't try to make conversation, for which Elizabeth was grateful. The day had been overwhelming enough without having to navigate the social complexities of getting to know a stranger who held her future in his hands. As they climbed, the air grew thinner and colder, but Elizabeth found herself feeling more hopeful with each step the horse took away from the crossroads where she had spent 3 desperate days. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than the slow starvation and grinding despair that had been her constant companions since leaving Silver Spring. The moon was rising by the time they reached Dennis's property, casting silver light over a landscape that took Elizabeth's breath away. The house sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by towering pines, built of logs and stone that seemed to grow out of the mountain itself. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows, making it look like something out of a fairy tale after the harsh reality of her recent life. "It's beautiful," she whispered, unable to keep the wonder out of her voice. Dennis helped her down from the horse, his hands steady and impersonal. "It's home," he said, simply, but she could hear the pride in his voice. "Come on, let's get you inside and warmed up. You look half frozen." The interior of the house was even more impressive than the outside. The main room was spacious and well-appointed, with a massive stone fireplace that threw dancing shadows on walls lined with books. The furniture was simple but well-made, and everything spoke of a man who had money but wasn't interested in showing off. It was comfortable rather than grand, practical rather than pretentious. "There's a room upstairs that you can use," Dennis said, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "It's got its own firelace and a good view of the valley. The kitchen's through there if you want to get familiar with it, and there's a wash house out back with a pump that draws from the spring." Elizabeth nodded, trying to take in all the information while still processing the fact that she was actually here, in a warm house with a roof that didn't leak and walls that kept out the wind. It felt surreal after weeks of uncertainty and fear. "Are you hungry?" Dennis asked. And at the mention of food, Elizabeth's stomach cramped so hard she had to press a hand to her middle. "I haven't eaten much in the past few days," she admitted. Dennis nodded as if he had expected as much. "There's stew on the stove and bread in the pantry. Help yourself to whatever you need. We'll talk more about the arrangement tomorrow when you've had a chance to rest and get your bearings." Elizabeth wanted to thank him, to find words adequate to express her gratitude, but everything she thought of seemed insufficient. Instead, she simply nodded and made her way to the kitchen, where the smell of beef stew made her mouth water so intensely it was almost painful. The kitchen was well organized and clean, with modern conveniences that she hadn't expected to find in such a remote location. There was a good stove, plenty of workspace, and shelves lined with dishes and cooking supplies. As she ladled stew into a bowl, she found herself already thinking about how she could improve the organization and what meals she might prepare to show Dennis that his faith in her wasn't misplaced. The stew was the best thing she had tasted in months, rich with beef and vegetables and seasoned with herbs that made her think of home. She ate slowly, savoring each bite and trying not to think about how close she had come to never tasting anything this good again. When she had finished, she washed her bowl and spoon, a small gesture that felt important somehow, a way of showing that she understood this was not charity, but the beginning of a working relationship. Dennis was sitting by the fire when she returned to the main room, reading a book by the light of an oil lamp. He looked up when she entered, and she saw something in his expression that might have been approval. "Feel better?" he asked. "Much, thank you." Elizabeth hesitated, then took a seat in the chair across from him. "I want you to know that I understand what you're offering me, and I won't take advantage of your kindness. I'll work hard and earn my keep." "I believe you will," Dennis said, closing his book and setting it aside. "But I want to be clear about something. This isn't charity, Elizabeth. I really do need help around here, and I think you're the right person for the job. Don't think of yourself as someone I'm rescuing. Think of yourself as someone I'm hiring because you have something valuable to offer." His words hit her harder than any kindness could have. For months, she had felt like nothing more than a burden, someone to be pitied or ignored. The idea that she might actually have value, that someone might want her skills and her work, was almost too much to process. "What happened to the last person who worked here?" she asked, suddenly curious about why the position was available. "There wasn't anyone before you," Dennis admitted. "I've been managing on my own since I built this place. But it's a lot of work, and I'm gone sometimes for days at a time, checking on my mining interests. It would be good to know someone reliable was here keeping things running." Elizabeth nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. She had kept house for her husband while he worked dangerous shifts in the mines, never knowing if he would come home each day. The responsibility of maintaining a home while worrying about someone else's safety was something she knew well. "What kind of schedule do you keep?" she asked. "When do you leave for your business, and when do you usually return?" "It varies," Dennis said. "Sometimes I'm gone for a day, sometimes a week. Depends on what needs attention. But I'll always let you know when I'm leaving and when I expect to be back. And if there's ever an emergency, there are neighbors about 5 miles down the mountain who can help." Elizabeth felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of being alone in such an isolated place, but she pushed it down. Loneliness was better than desperation, and solitude was better than the kind of company she had been keeping in recent weeks. "I should probably get some rest," she said, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the day settling into her bones. "It's been a long time since I've had a real bed to sleep in." Dennis stood as well, picking up the oil lamp. "I'll show you to your room. There are extra blankets in the chest at about a foot of the bed, and if you need anything during the night, and don't hesitate to knock on my door. It's just down the hall." He led her up a narrow staircase to a room that was larger and more comfortable than any space she had called her own in months. The bed was covered with a thick quilt, and there was indeed a small fireplace with wood stacked neatly beside it. A window looked out over the valley, and even in the moonlight, she could see the breathtaking vista that would greet her in the morning. "This is perfect," she said, running her hand over the smooth wood of the dresser. "More than I could have hoped for." Dennis nodded, setting the lamp on the bedside table. "Sleep well, Elizabeth. Tomorrow we'll go over the details of what needs doing around here. But tonight, just rest. You've earned it." After he left, Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she had woken up in a cave, cold and hungry and desperate. Tonight she was in a warm room with a soft bed and the promise of steady work. It seemed too good to be true, but the solid reality of the walls around her and the full feeling in her stomach suggested that maybe, just maybe, her luck really had changed. She changed into the clean nightgown she found in the dresser, a thoughtful touch that brought tears to her eyes. When had Dennis prepared this room for her? Had he been planning to offer her work from the moment he saw her, or had he made the decision spontaneously? Either way, the care he had taken to make her comfortable spoke to a kindness that went beyond mere practicality. As she settled under the thick quilts, Elizabeth allowed herself to think about the future for the first time in months. Maybe she could make a real life here, build something stable and secure. Maybe she could prove to herself and to Dennis that she was worth the chance he had taken on her. The thought filled her with a determination she hadn't felt since her husband's death, a sense of purpose that made her feel more like herself than she had in far too long. Outside her window, the mountain wind continued to howl, but inside her room, Elizabeth was warm and safe, and for the first time in months, hopeful about tomorrow. She woke before dawn to the sound of someone moving around downstairs. For a moment, disorientation clouded her thoughts as she tried to remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she sat up quickly, realizing that Dennis was probably starting his day and expecting her to do the same. The fire in her room had burned down to embers, but the house was warm, suggesting that Dennis had been up for a while tending to the main fireplace. Elizabeth dressed quickly in her worn but clean dress, wishing she had something more appropriate for housework, but grateful for what she had. She braided her dark hair back from her face and made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and bacon. Dennis was in the kitchen, fully dressed and apparently ready to start his day. He looked up when she entered, and she was relieved to see no regret or second thoughts in his expression. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Elizabeth replied honestly. "Thank you for the nightgown. That was very thoughtful." Dennis shrugged as if it were nothing, but she caught a slight flush on his weathered cheeks. Seemed like the right thing to do. "There's coffee on the stove and breakfast if you're hungry." Elizabeth poured herself a cup of coffee, savoring the rich aroma. Real coffee was another luxury she had been forced to give up in recent months. "What time do you usually start your day?" she asked. "Early. The mine operations start at dawn. And if I'm going down to check on things, I like to get there before the workers arrive." Dennis handed her a plate with bacon, eggs, and biscuits that made her mouth water. "But today, I thought I'd stay close to home, show you around the property, and explain what needs doing." Elizabeth nodded, grateful for his consideration. She had been worried about being thrown into her duties without proper guidance, but Dennis seemed to understand that she needed time to adjust and learn his preferences. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, and Elizabeth found herself studying her new employer more closely in the morning light. He was probably in his late 30s, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of outdoor work. His hands were scarred and calloused, speaking of labor that went beyond simply owning mines and counting profits. There was something solid and dependable about him that made her feel secure in a way she hadn't experienced since her husband's death. After breakfast, Dennis led her on a tour of the property. The house was larger than it had seemed the night before, with multiple bedrooms, a library, and even a small office where Dennis kept his business papers. The kitchen was modern and well-equipped, and there was a separate pantry stocked with supplies that could last through a hard winter. "I try to keep everything well stocked," Dennis explained as they walked through the various rooms. "When the snow comes, we might not be able to get to town for weeks at a time. Self-sufficiency is important up here." Elizabeth nodded, making mental notes about organization and maintenance needs. The house was clean, but had the slightly neglected feel of a place maintained by someone who saw it as shelter rather than a home. She could already envision changes that would make it more comfortable and welcoming. Outside, Dennis showed her the barn where he kept his horses, the smokehouse, the root cellar, and the various outbuildings that supported life in such an isolated location. Everything was well built and functional, but she could see places where a woman's touch would make improvements. "The main thing I need help with is the day-to-day maintenance," Dennis said as they walked back toward the house. "Cooking, cleaning, laundry, that sort of thing. I can handle the heavy work and the outside chores, but I'm not much good at making a place feel lived in." "I can do all of that," Elizabeth assured him. "And if you don't mind, I have some ideas about organization and efficiency that might make things easier." Dennis looked interested rather than defensive, which relieved her. Some men didn't take well to suggestions from women, especially about their own homes. "I'm open to improvements. You probably know more about running a household than I do." They spent the morning going over practical details, where supplies were kept, what Dennis's preferences were for meals, how often various tasks needed to be done. Elizabeth took mental notes on everything, determined to prove that his faith in her was justified. It was while they were discussing the weekly routine that they heard the sound of horses approaching. Dennis's expression immediately became more guarded, and Elizabeth felt a flutter of anxiety. She had hoped to have more time to settle in before having to face the judgment of others. "Expecting company?" she asked. "No," Dennis said grimly, "but I have a feeling I know who it is." Three men rode into the clearing, and Elizabeth could tell immediately that they weren't friendly visitors. They had the hard, suspicious look of men who had come looking for trouble. The leader, a heavy-set man with graying hair and cold eyes, dismounted and approached them with the swagger of someone accustomed to intimidating others. "Myers," the man said, his tone carrying barely concealed hostility, "heard you picked up some company yesterday." Dennis stepped slightly in front of Elizabeth, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by any of them. "Charles Anderson, what brings you up here?" "Just being neighborly," Charles replied, but his eyes were fixed on Elizabeth with an expression that made her skin crawl. "Wanted to meet your new housekeeper. Make sure she's the right sort for a respectable man like yourself." Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had expected this kind of reaction, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. Elizabeth is working for me, nothing more, Dennis said, his voice carrying a warning edge. And what goes on at my place is my business, not yours. Charles laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Come on, Myers, we all know what kind of work a woman like that does. Found her begging on the road, didn't you? What kind of respectable woman ends up in that situation? Elizabeth felt something snap inside her. She had endured months of shame and judgment, but she was tired of being talked about as if she weren't standing right there. She stepped forward, ignoring Dennis's restraining hand on her arm. The kind who lost her husband in a mine cave-in and was turned out of her home when the company couldn't pay its debts, she said, her voice steady despite the anger coursing through her. The kind who chose to work honestly rather than compromise her principles. The kind who knows the difference between a man offering honest employment and men who come looking to cause trouble. Charles's face darkened at her defiance. You've got a mouth on you, don't you? Maybe Myers here doesn't know what he's gotten himself into. Maybe you don't know when you're not welcome, Dennis said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. I think it's time for you to leave. This isn't over, Myers, Charles said, remounting his horse. People are going to talk about this arrangement of yours. Might hurt your business relationships down in town. Let them talk, Dennis replied. I've never much cared what small minds think about my affairs. After the men rode away, Elizabeth found herself shaking with reaction. The confrontation had brought back all the helplessness and humiliation she had felt in recent months, but it had also awakened something fierce and protective in her. I'm sorry, she said to Dennis. I shouldn't have spoken up like that. I might have made things worse for you. Dennis looked at her with something that might have been admiration. Don't apologize for standing up for yourself. Charles Anderson is a bully who's used to intimidating people. It did him good to hear someone talk back. But he's right about one thing, Elizabeth said, her voice quiet. People will talk. It might cause problems for your business. Dennis was quiet for a long moment, and Elizabeth felt her heart sink. Maybe he was already regretting his decision to help her. Maybe the reality of the social complications was making him reconsider. Elizabeth, he said finally, I want you to understand something. I didn't offer you this job because I felt sorry for you. I offered it because I thought you could do the work and because I liked what I saw in you. Nothing that happened just now changes that. But your reputation, my reputation is based on the quality of my work and the fairness of my dealings, not on what Charles Anderson thinks about my household arrangements. Dennis's voice was firm. If people want to judge me for giving honest work to someone who needs it, that says more about them than it does about me. Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. It had been so long since anyone had defended her, had seen her as worth defending, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. Thank you, she said simply. Don't thank me yet, Dennis said with a slight smile. Wait until you've been here through a mountain winter. You might change your mind about this being a good situation. Elizabeth smiled back, feeling lighter than she had in months. I've survived worse things than cold weather. I think I can handle whatever this mountain can throw at me. Over the following days, Elizabeth threw herself into her work with an energy and enthusiasm that surprised them both. She reorganized the kitchen for maximum efficiency, established routines that kept the house running smoothly, and began preparing meals that transformed Dennis's simple fare into something approaching luxury. Dennis, for his part, found himself looking forward to coming home in the evenings. The house felt different now, warmer somehow, and not just because Elizabeth kept the fires burning. There were small touches that spoke of care and attention, flowers from the mountain meadows in simple vases, bread baking in the oven, the subtle improvements in organization that made daily life easier. But it was the conversations that surprised him most. Elizabeth was intelligent and well-read, able to discuss everything from literature to politics with an insight that challenged and engaged him. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit by the fire and talk, and Dennis found himself sharing thoughts and opinions he had kept to himself for years. You're not what I expected, he told her one evening as they sat reading in comfortable silence. Elizabeth looked up from her book, raising an eyebrow. What did you expect? Dennis considered the question seriously. Someone more broken, I suppose. Someone who had given up. I came close, Elizabeth admitted. There were days when I wondered if it would be easier to just stop fighting, but something in me refused to quit. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the belief that things had to get better eventually. I'm glad you didn't give up, Dennis said quietly. Elizabeth felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in a long time, something that went beyond gratitude or simple friendship. She pushed the feeling down, reminding herself that this was a business arrangement, nothing more. Dennis had been clear about that from the beginning, and she couldn't afford to complicate things by developing feelings that weren't reciprocated. But as the weeks passed, it became harder to ignore the growing connection between them. There were moments of shared laughter, comfortable silences that spoke of understanding, and a growing trust that went beyond employer and employee. Elizabeth found herself looking forward to Dennis's return from his business trips, and she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that suggested his feelings might be more complicated than either of them had expected. It was during Dennis's absence on a week-long trip to check on his mining operations that trouble came calling again. Elizabeth was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard horses approaching. Through the window, she could see Charles Anderson and two other men dismounting in the yard, and her heart began to race. She considered hiding, but something in her rebelled against the idea of cowering in her own home. Instead, she dried her hands on her apron and went to meet them at the front door, keeping it firmly closed between them. Mr. Myers isn't here, she called through the door. You'll have to come back another time. We're not here to see Myers, Charles replied. We're here to see you. Elizabeth's blood ran cold, but she kept her voice steady. I have nothing to say to you. Open the door, woman. We just want to talk. No, Elizabeth's voice was firm. You can say whatever you need to say from where you are. Charles's voice turned ugly. You think you're better than you are, don't you? Living up here like some kind of lady when everyone knows what you really are. Myers might be fool enough to fall for your act, but we're not. Elizabeth felt anger override her fear. What I am is a woman trying to make an honest living. What you are is men with nothing better to do than harass someone who's done nothing to you. Done nothing? One of the other men laughed harshly. You've bewitched one of the most successful men in the territory. Got him thinking with something other than his brain. That affects all of us who do business with him. Mr. Myers is perfectly capable of making his own decisions, Elizabeth replied. If you have business concerns, take them up with him. Maybe we will, Charles said menacingly, and maybe we'll make sure he understands exactly what kind of woman he's harboring up here. The threat was clear, and Elizabeth felt her courage begin to waver. These men had the power to destroy not just her reputation, but Dennis's as well. They could spread lies that would be impossible to disprove, could make life difficult for Dennis in ways she couldn't even imagine. What do you want? She asked quietly. We want you gone, Charles said bluntly. Pack your things and leave. Find some other place to ply your trade. Stop embarrassing a decent man who's obviously not thinking clearly. Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She could leave, disappear into the mountains, and spare Dennis the trouble these men could cause. It would be the noble thing to do, the selfless choice that would protect the man who had shown her such kindness. But something in her rebelled against the idea of running again, of letting bullies dictate the terms of her life. She had found something here worth fighting for, not just the bond, but the sense of belonging, the feeling of being valued for who she was rather than pitied for what she had lost. No, she said, her voice growing stronger. I won't leave. This is my home now, and you have no right to drive me away from it. The silence that followed her declaration seemed to stretch forever. Then Charles spoke, and his voice carried a promise of trouble. Have it your way, but don't say we didn't warn you. When Myers comes to his senses and throws you out, don't come crying to us. Elizabeth listened to the sound of their horses departing, then sank against the door, her legs suddenly weak. She had made her choice, but she couldn't help wondering if she had just made a terrible mistake. What if these men could turn Dennis against her? What if their threats weren't empty? She spent the rest of the evening in a state of anxious worry, jumping at every sound and wondering if she had been foolish to stand her ground. By the time Dennis returned the following afternoon, she had worked herself into a state of near panic. Elizabeth? Dennis's voice carried concern as he found her in the kitchen, staring out the window with unseeing eyes. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Elizabeth turned to face him, and the relief of having him home safe was so overwhelming that she felt tears start to flow. Charles Anderson was here, she said. He and two other men. They wanted me to leave. Dennis's expression darkened immediately. What did they say to you? Elizabeth recounted the conversation as accurately as she could, watching Dennis's face grow grimmer with each detail. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight with anger. I should have expected this, he said finally. Anderson's been looking for ways to cause me trouble ever since I outbid him on the mineral rights to the eastern slope. He sees you as a weakness he can exploit. Maybe I should go, Elizabeth said quietly. I don't want to cause problems for you. Dennis turned to face her fully, his eyes blazing with an intensity that took her breath away. Is that what you want? To leave? Elizabeth met his gaze, seeing something there that made her heart race. No, she whispered. I don't want to leave. This is the first place I've felt at home since my husband died. But I don't want to hurt you, Town, either. You're not hurting me, Dennis said, stepping closer. You're the best thing that's happened to me in years. I'm not going to let Charles Anderson or anyone else drive you away. The space between them seemed to crackle with tension, and Elizabeth found herself struggling to breathe. There was something in Dennis's eyes that spoke of feelings far deeper than employer to employee, something that matched the growing warmth in her own heart. Dennis, she said softly, his name a question and a plea. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears she hadn't realized were still falling. Elizabeth, I need you to know that what I'm feeling for you has nothing to do with pity or charity. You're strong and beautiful and intelligent, and He trailed off, seeming to struggle with words that had never been spoken aloud. Elizabeth felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for him to continue. I think I'm falling in love with you, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Elizabeth felt the world shift around her. Everything she had believed about her situation suddenly turned upside down. Dennis, You don't have to say anything, he said quickly. I know this complicates things. I know it's not what either of us planned, but I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just gratitude or friendship. Elizabeth searched his face, seeing the vulnerability there, the fear that she might reject him, or worse, that she might feel obligated to accept him because of their circumstances. But what she felt for him had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with the way he made her feel valued and cherished and whole. I love you too, she said, the words coming out in a rush. I've been trying not to, trying to convince myself it was just gratitude. But it's so much more than that. Dennis's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, and when he kissed her, Elizabeth felt as if she were coming home after a journey she hadn't even realized she was taking. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise, a kiss that spoke of new beginnings and second chances. When they broke apart, Elizabeth rested her forehead against his, marveling at how much her life had changed in such a short time. What happens now, she asked. Now we figure out how to build a life together, Dennis said. But first, we deal with Charles Anderson and his threats. I won't have him thinking he can intimidate the woman I love. Elizabeth felt a thrill at hearing him call her the woman he loved, but worry still clouded her thoughts. What can we do? He has influence in town and people are already talking. Let them talk, Dennis said firmly. I have something more important than Anderson's approval. I have you, and I have the truth. That's enough to build on. Over the next few days, Dennis made his position clear to anyone who would listen. He went to town and conducted his business as usual, making no attempt to hide his relationship with Elizabeth or apologize for it. When people made snide comments or asked probing questions, he answered with calm dignity, making it clear that Elizabeth was not just his housekeeper, but the woman he intended to marry. The reaction was mixed. Some people, particularly those who had known Dennis for years and respected his character, were willing to give Elizabeth the benefit of the doubt. Others, led by Charles Anderson, continued to spread rumors and make life difficult wherever they could. It came to a head one afternoon when Dennis and Elizabeth were in town together, shopping for supplies. Charles Anderson confronted them outside the general store, his voice loud enough to draw a crowd. "Still parading your whore around town, Myers?" he said, his words carrying clearly to everyone within earshot. The insult hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. But before she could react, Dennis stepped forward, his face dark with fury. "You'll apologize to the lady," he said, his voice deadly quiet. Charles laughed. "Lady? That's rich. We all know what she was doing before you picked her up. Begging on the road like a common—" He never finished the sentence. Dennis's fist connected with his jaw, with a sound like a gunshot, and Charles went down hard, blood streaming from his split lip. The crowd gasped and stepped back as Dennis stood over the fallen man, his fists still clenched. "I said apologize to the lady." Charles struggled to his feet, wiping blood from his mouth. For a moment, Elizabeth thought he might continue the fight, but something in Dennis's expression must have warned him off. Instead, he spat in the dirt and stalked away, followed by his supporters. The remaining crowd dispersed slowly, leaving Dennis and Elizabeth standing alone in the dusty street. Elizabeth was shaking, not from fear, but from the overwhelming emotion of having someone defend her honor so completely. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," Dennis replied, taking at her hand. "I won't have anyone speak about you that way. Ever." Elizabeth squeezed his hand, feeling a surge of love so strong it took her breath away. "Thank you." "Don't thank me for doing what any decent man would do for the woman he loves," Dennis said. "Come on, let's finish our shopping and go home." As they walked into the store, Elizabeth noticed that people were looking at them differently now. There was still judgment in some eyes, but there was also a new respect. Dennis had made his position clear in the most public way possible, and everyone now understood that Elizabeth was under his protection. The storekeeper, an elderly man named Kyle Rogers, who had always been polite to Dennis, greeted them with unusual warmth. "Afternoon, Dennis. Miss Elizabeth. What can I get for you today?" As they conducted their business, Elizabeth noticed that Kyle went out of his way to be courteous to her, asking her opinion on various items, and treating her with the respect due to a valued customer. Other patrons in the store followed his lead, and by the time they left, Elizabeth felt as if something fundamental had shifted in her favor. "That was unexpected," she said as they loaded their purchases into the wagon. "Kyle's a good man," Dennis said. "He judges people by their actions, not their circumstances. There are more like him than like Anderson, even if they're not always as vocal about it." As they drove home through the mountain passes, Elizabeth reflected on how much her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate woman with no prospects and no hope. Now she was loved and protected, with a home and a future that seemed bright with possibility. "Dennis," she said as they neared the house, "what you said about marrying me, did you mean it?" Dennis pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her, his expression serious. "I meant every word. If you'll have me, Elizabeth. I know it's not the most romantic proposal, but I want you to be my wife. I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Elizabeth felt tears of joy spring into her eyes. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." Dennis's smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left them both breathless. When they broke apart, Elizabeth rested her head against his shoulder, marveling at the turn her life had taken. "When?" she asked. "Soon as you want," Dennis replied. "Tomorrow, if you'd like. I don't want to wait any longer than necessary to make you my wife." Elizabeth laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Maybe we should wait a little longer than tomorrow. I'd like to have a proper dress, at least." "Whatever you want," Dennis said, his voice warm with love. "We have all the time in the world now." As they drove the rest of the way home, Elizabeth thought about the woman she had been when she first met Dennis, huddled in that cave and begging for scraps of kindness from strangers. That woman seemed like someone from another lifetime, someone she could barely recognize. In her place was a woman who was loved and valued, who had found her strength and her voice, who was ready to build a future based on hope rather than desperation. The house came into view as they crested the final hill, smoke rising from the chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. It looked like what it had become, a home filled with love and possibility, a place where two people who had found each other against all odds could build something beautiful together. As Dennis helped her down from the wagon, Elizabeth looked up at the man who had changed her life so completely. He had offered her honest work when she needed it most, defended her honor when others attacked it, and given her his love when she had thought herself unworthy of such a gift. "I love you," she said, the words still feeling new and wonderful on her tongue. "And I love you," Dennis replied, pulling her close. "More than I ever thought possible." They stood there in the gathering dusk, holding each other and looking toward a future that seemed bright with promise. Elizabeth thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment, the pain and loss that had seemed insurmountable, the desperation that had driven her to that crossroads where Dennis had found her. It had all been worth it, every moment of suffering and fear, because it had led her here to this man, to this love, to this life that was more than she had ever dared to dream possible. The next few weeks passed in a blur of wedding preparations and quiet happiness. Elizabeth had never imagined she would marry again after her husband's death. But Dennis made her feel as if she were embarking on an entirely new chapter of her life, rather than trying to recreate something that was lost. They were married on a crisp autumn morning, with Kyle Rogers serving as witness and Nancy Baker, the doctor's wife from town, standing up with Elizabeth. It was a simple ceremony, but it felt perfect to both of them. Dennis had bought Elizabeth a beautiful blue dress that made her eyes sparkle, and she had never felt more beautiful than she did walking down the aisle of the small mountain church toward the man who loved her. After the ceremony, they returned to their home, which now felt truly like theirs rather than just his. Elizabeth had made small changes throughout the house, adding feminine touches that made it warmer and more welcoming. Dennis had given her free rein to make whatever alterations she wanted, and she had transformed the place into something that reflected both of their personalities. As winter settled over the mountains, Elizabeth discovered that she loved the isolation she had once feared. The long evenings by the fire with Dennis, the quiet days when the snow fell steadily outside their windows, the sense of being completely cut off from the outside world and its judgments, all of it felt like a gift. Dennis proved to be an attentive and loving husband, treating Elizabeth with a respect and tenderness that made her feel cherished every day. He consulted her on business decisions, valued her opinions, and made it clear in countless small ways that he considered her his equal partner in all things. One evening, as they sat by the fire reading, Elizabeth looked up from her book to find Dennis watching her with an expression of such love that it took her breath away. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Just how lucky I am," Dennis replied. "How different my life is now because I happened to be riding that road the day I found you." Elizabeth smiled, remembering that desperate woman who had been huddled in the cave. "I was so frightened that day. I thought you might be just another person who would pass by without seeing me." "I saw you," Dennis said softly. "I saw your strength and your dignity, even when you were at your lowest point. That's what made me stop." "And I saw your kindness," Elizabeth replied. "Your willingness to take a chance on someone you didn't know. That's what made me trust you." Dennis set aside his book and moved to sit beside her on the sofa, pulling her into his arms. "I want you to know something, Elizabeth. What happened to you before we met, the circumstances that brought you to that crossroads, none of that matters to me. What matters is who you are now, who you've always been underneath the hardship." Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes. "I used to be so ashamed of how low I had fallen, of the fact that people saw me begging on the road. It felt like I had lost everything that made me who I was." "You never lost who you were," Dennis said firmly. "You just lost the external things that other people use to judge worth. But your real worth, your strength and intelligence and capacity for love, that was always there. I just helped you remember it." Elizabeth kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they broke apart, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I want to tell you something," she said quietly. "Something I've never told anyone." Dennis's arms tightened around her encouragingly. "You can tell me anything. When I was at my lowest point, when I was begging on that road and feeling like I had lost everything that mattered, I used to dream about what it would be like to have someone love me again. Not out of pity or obligation, but really love me for who I was. I thought it was impossible, that I had fallen too far to ever deserve that kind of love again. And now, Dennis asked gently. Now I know that love isn't about deserving, Elizabeth said. It's about recognizing something valuable in another person and choosing to cherish it. You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, and your love helped me find my way back to who I really am. Dennis was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. You did the same thing for me, Elizabeth. I didn't realize how empty my life was until you filled it with warmth and laughter and purpose. You made me remember what it feels like to have someone to come home to, someone who cares about my day and my thoughts and my dreams. They held each other in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to glowing embers. Outside, the wind howled through the mountain passes, but inside their home, they were warm and safe and completely content. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal and new beginnings. Elizabeth had been married to Dennis for 6 months, and she had never been happier. The harsh words and cruel judgments of people like Charles Anderson seemed like distant memories, powerless to touch the life she had built with her husband. One morning, as she was working in the garden they had planted together, Elizabeth heard the sound of horses approaching. She looked up to see a small group of riders coming up the mountain trail. But these weren't the hostile visitors they had dealt with before. These were women, and they were riding with the purposeful air of people on a mission. Elizabeth recognized Nancy Baker in the lead, along with two other women from town whom she knew by sight but had never spoken to. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to meet them, curious about what had brought them so far from town. Mrs. Myers, Nancy said as she dismounted, using Elizabeth's married name with a respect that warmed her heart. I hope you don't mind us calling unannounced. Of course not, Elizabeth replied, though she was puzzled by the visit. Please come inside, I'll put on some coffee. As they settled around the kitchen table, Nancy explained the purpose of their visit. We've come to ask for your help, she said. There's a situation in town that we think you might be uniquely qualified to address. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What kind of situation? There's a young woman who's found herself in circumstances similar to what you experienced, Nancy said carefully. Her husband died in a mining accident, and she's been left with nothing. She has two small children, and she's been struggling to find work or assistance. Elizabeth felt her heart clench with sympathy. What's her name? Donna Anderson, Nancy said, and Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise. Anderson? As in Charles Anderson? His daughter-in-law, Nancy confirmed. Charles has disowned her since his son died, says she's not his responsibility anymore. The other families in town have been reluctant to help because they don't want to cross Charles, but the woman is desperate. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, processing the irony of the situation. Charles Anderson, who had been so cruel to her, now had a family member in the same desperate circumstances she had once faced. What kind of help are you looking for? She asked finally. We were hoping you might talk to her, said one of the other women, introducing herself as Evelyn Kim. You understand what she's going through in a way that the rest of us can't. And you've shown that it's possible to rebuild a life after such losses. Elizabeth nodded slowly, understanding the request. Where is she now? Living in a shack on the outskirts of town with her children, Nancy said. She's too proud to beg, but she's running out of options. We're afraid she might do something desperate if she doesn't get help soon. Elizabeth thought about her own desperate days, the crushing weight of hopelessness, and the way it could drive someone to make choices they never thought they would consider. I'll talk to her, she said, but I can't promise she'll listen. Pride can be a powerful thing, especially when it's all you have left. The women exchanged relieved glances. Thank you, Nancy said. We knew you would understand. After the women left, Elizabeth told Dennis about their visit and her promise to help Donna Anderson. He listened thoughtfully, then nodded his approval. It's the right thing to do, he said. Regardless of how Charles treated you, his daughter-in-law and her children are innocent in all of this. I keep thinking about how different things might have been if someone hadn't been willing to help me when I needed it most, Elizabeth said. Maybe I can be that person for her. The next day, Elizabeth rode down to town with Dennis, who had business at the bank. While he conducted his affairs, she made her way to the ramshackle building on the edge of town where Donna Anderson was living with her children. The sight that greeted her was heartbreakingly familiar. Donna was a young woman, probably not yet 25, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been eating enough for too long. Her children, a boy of perhaps 4 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 2, clung to her skirts with the fearful wariness of children who had learned not to expect good things from strangers. "Mrs. Anderson," Elizabeth said gently, "my name is Elizabeth Myers. I was hoping I could speak with you for a few minutes." Donna's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "If you're here from the church with more charity." "I've told them I don't need their pity." "I'm not here from the church," Elizabeth said. "I'm here because I know what it's like to lose everything and not know where to turn next." Something in Elizabeth's tone must have gotten through to Donna because her defensive posture softened slightly. "What do you want?" "Just to talk," Elizabeth said. "Woman to woman, about survival and pride and the choices we make when we're desperate." Donna studied Elizabeth's face for a long moment, then stepped aside to let her into the one-room shack that served as home for her small family. The space was clean but sparse, with little furniture and fewer possessions. Elizabeth could see that Donna was doing her best to maintain some dignity and normalcy for her children, but the effort was clearly taking its toll. "I heard about your husband," Elizabeth said gently. "I'm sorry for your loss." Donna's composure cracked slightly. "He was a good man, worked hard, provided for us. I never thought I'd be in this situation." "None of us do," Elizabeth said. "6 months ago, I was living in a cave and begging for food on the mountain road. I thought my life was over." Donna's eyes widened. "You're the woman Charles talks about. The one who—" She trailed off, looking embarrassed. "The one who married Dennis Myers after he found me begging, yes," Elizabeth said matter-of-factly. "I imagine Charles has had some colorful things to say about me. He says you're a fortune hunter who took advantage of a lonely man," Donna said quietly. Elizabeth smiled sadly. "Charles says a lot of things. Most of them aren't true. The truth is that Dennis saved my life by offering me honest work when I needed it most. And I fell in love with him because he's a good man who saw something worth saving in me when I couldn't see it myself." Donna was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to know that there's no shame in accepting help when you need it," Elizabeth said. "And I want you to know that your current circumstances don't define who you are or what you're worth." "Easy words when you're not the one living them," Donna said bitterly. "I lived them for months," Elizabeth replied. "I know how it feels to have people look through you like you don't exist. I know what it's like to choose between pride and survival. And I know what it's like to believe that you've fallen so far that there's no way back up." Donna's youngest child began to fuss, and she picked up the little girl, holding her close. "What am I supposed to do? Charles has made it clear that he wants nothing to do with us. The other families in town are afraid to cross him. I can't find work that pays enough to support us, and I can't leave the children alone to work longer hours." Elizabeth remembered her own impossible situation, the way every option had seemed closed off. "There are people who want to help you, but you have to let them." "I don't want charity," Donna said fiercely. "Neither did I," Elizabeth replied, "but sometimes what looks like charity is actually an opportunity. The women who came to see me yesterday, they're not offering you handouts. They're offering you a chance to rebuild your life." Donna looked skeptical. "What kind of chance?" "Nancy Baker needs help with her medical practice. Her husband has been talking about hiring someone to help with the administrative work, someone who can read and write and handle the bookkeeping. The pay would be enough to support you and your children, and there's a small apartment above the office that you could use." Donna's eyes lit up with hope, then darkened with suspicion. "Why would they offer that to me? What's the catch?" "No catch," Elizabeth said. "Just people who believe that everyone deserves a second chance. But you have to be willing to take it." Donna was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with her pride and her desperation. Elizabeth waited patiently, remembering her own internal struggle when Dennis had first offered her work. "What if I'm not good enough?" Donna asked finally. "What if I disappoint them?" "What if you are good enough?" Elizabeth countered. "What if this is exactly the opportunity you need to build a better life for your children?" Donna looked around the shabby room, then down at her children, who were watching the conversation with the serious expressions of children who had learned to be quiet when adults were talking about important things. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Elizabeth said with a smile. "Thank me when you're settled in your new job and your children are thriving." As Elizabeth prepared to leave, Donna caught her arm. "Mrs. Myers, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret it? Accepting help when you were desperate? Do you ever feel like you lost something of yourself?" Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "I thought I would," she said finally. "I thought accepting help would make me less than I was before, but what I learned is that sometimes letting people help you is the strongest thing you can do. It takes courage to admit you can't do everything alone, and it takes wisdom to recognize when someone is offering you a genuine opportunity rather than empty charity." Donna nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for coming to see me. Thank you for understanding." "We have to look out for each other," Elizabeth said, "especially those of us who know what it's like to fall and have to find our way back up." As Elizabeth rode back up the mountain to her home, she reflected on how strange life could be. 6 months ago, she had been the one in desperate need of help. Now she was in a position to offer that same help to someone else. The circle of kindness that had begun when Dennis stopped to help her was continuing, reaching out to touch other lives that needed hope and second chances. Dennis was waiting for her when she arrived home, and she told him about her conversation with Donna Anderson. "How do you think she'll decide?" he asked. "I think she'll take the well," Elizabeth said. "She's desperate enough to swallow her pride, and she's smart enough to recognize a genuine opportunity when she sees one. And if Charles Anderson causes trouble about it," Elizabeth smiled, "then Nancy Baker and the other women will handle him. I have a feeling that Charles is going to discover that his influence isn't as strong as he thinks it is when it comes to people doing what they believe is right." A week later, Elizabeth received word that Donna Anderson had accepted the position with Dr. Baker and was settling into her new life with her children. The news filled Elizabeth with a satisfaction that went beyond simple charity. She had been able to use her own experience to help someone else find their way out of desperation, and in doing so, she had discovered another layer of meaning in her own journey. That evening, as she and Dennis sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Elizabeth reflected on how much her life had changed since that desperate day when she had been begging at the crossroads. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't stopped that day?" she asked Dennis. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not with regret. I think we were meant to find each other, Elizabeth. Maybe not in the way it happened, but somehow, somewhere, our paths were always going to cross." Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him and the security of their love. "I used to think that losing my first husband was the end of my story. I thought I would never be happy again, never feel whole again. And now? Now I know that it wasn't the end. It was just the end of one chapter. The beginning of another was waiting for me, but I had to go through the darkness to get to it." Dennis kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. "I'm glad you didn't give up during the dark times." "I'm glad you saw something worth saving when you found me," Elizabeth replied. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elizabeth thought about all the women like her and Donna Anderson, women who had fallen on hard times and were struggling to find their way back to hope. She thought about the power of kindness, the way one person's willingness to help could change the course of another person's entire life. She had been transformed from a desperate woman begging for scraps into a beloved wife with a home and a purpose. But more than that, she had been transformed from someone who felt worthless into someone who knew her own value, from someone who was ashamed of her circumstances into someone who could use her experience to help others. The journey from that cave to this porch had been long and difficult, but every step had been worth it. Every moment of desperation had led to this moment of contentment. Every tear had watered the ground where her new life had grown. As Dennis stood and offered her his hand to go inside, Elizabeth took it with the same trust she had shown that first night when he had helped her onto his horse. But now that trust was built on months of shared experiences, on love that had been tested and proven strong, on a partnership that had enriched both their lives. "Come on, Mrs. Myers," Dennis said with a smile that still made her heart flutter. Let's go home." Elizabeth smiled back, her heart full of gratitude for the man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, who had offered her not just work, but a chance at a new life, who had loved her not despite her circumstances, but because of the strength she had shown in surviving them. "Home," she repeated, the word carrying all the weight of safety and belonging and love that she had thought she would never feel again. As they walked into their house together, Elizabeth thought about that desperate woman who had once huddled in a cave, begging for mercy from an unforgiving world. That woman seemed like someone from another lifetime, someone she could barely recognize. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth, who had found love and purpose and the strength to help others find their way out of darkness. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been complete. Elizabeth had learned that sometimes the lowest points in life weren't endings, but beginnings. That sometimes what looked like failure was actually preparation for something better than you had ever dared to imagine. She had been found begging on a mountain road by a man who saw something worth saving in her. But what she had discovered in the months since was that she had always been worth saving, had always carried within her the seeds of the life she was now living. Dennis hadn't rescued her so much as he had given her the opportunity to rescue herself, to remember who she was beneath the circumstances that had temporarily defined her. Now, as she settled into the evening routine of their shared life, Elizabeth felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that her story had become one of triumph rather than tragedy, of love rather than loss, of hope rather than despair. She had learned that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of life begin with the words, "I never thought this could happen to me," and that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the worst disasters. The wind still howled through the mountain passes on winter nights, but Elizabeth no longer heard it as a sound of desolation. Now it sounded like the voice of the wilderness itself, wild and free and full of possibilities. She had found her place in this harsh but beautiful landscape, had made a home in the mountains with a man who loved her for exactly who she was. And sometimes late at night when she couldn't sleep, Elizabeth would think about other women who might be facing their own desperate crossroads, who might be wondering if they had fallen too far to ever climb back up. She would send a silent prayer into the darkness, hoping that they too would find their own version of Dennis Myers, someone willing to see past circumstances to the person underneath, someone willing to offer not just charity, but genuine opportunity. Because she had learned that salvation rarely comes in the form we expect it, and that sometimes the people who save us are the ones who need saving themselves. She had found her rescuer in a lonely mountain man who had been living an empty life until she filled it with warmth and purpose. They had saved each other, really. Two lost souls who had found in each other the missing pieces of themselves. As she drifted off to sleep in the warm bed she shared with her husband, Elizabeth smiled at the memory of that first night in this house, when she had been so overwhelmed by the simple luxury of a real bed and a roof that didn't leak. Now this house was truly home, filled with love and laughter and the daily rhythms of a life shared with someone who cherished her. She had come so far from that desperate woman begging at the crossroads, but she would never forget her. That woman's courage in the face of impossible circumstances, her refusal to give up even when giving up would have been easier, her willingness to trust a stranger who offered her a chance at something better, all of that had led to this moment of perfect contentment. Elizabeth Myers fell asleep to the sound of her husband's steady breathing and the whisper of wind through the pines, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to be with, living exactly the life she was meant to live. It had taken a journey through darkness to reach this light, but every step had been worth it for the ray of this ending that was really just another beginning.